Let's actually talk about that first.
Bruh.
And
Look at this
think
dude.
about the very last
Wait till you see
sentence
the.
of this.
No, no, no,
Spanish
no.
commentary from Gospel of Mark. We only covered two lectures. Lecture
So yesterday when I recorded a live stream about Soren Kierkegaard's philosophical fragment,
Are you sick of nerds trying to get you to read? Here at Neuroposter, we're training an army of nitwits to flood internet comment sections, correcting people on books they have not read. How do we plan to defeat these nerds? By copying the exact same video format. Buckle up and enjoy the ride.
Alright guys, it's your boy. We're going to be moving straight into chapter 1. Got a little whiteboard here. These are the only notes that I've got going for me for this first chapter, which has a really dumb name, but it's to do with commodities, right? And particularly discussing the twofold nature of commodities, which is famously described as use values and exchange values, and we're going to get into what those are, what those mean, and also a little bit of some of the presuppositions, Marx's methodology, and all of that good stuff that will help us understand his investigation into capitalism, beginning with the commodity in chapter 1, commodities. Today we're talking about section 1, the two factors of a commodity, use value and value, the substance of value, and the magnitude of value. It's the first thing you'll notice. Dumb name. Who cares? But it is also accurate, talking about use value and value. What? What does that mean? Well, we're going to get right into that today. But first, let us just vibe a little, Just chill out on the camera. You guys vibing with me right now? Good. Let's bring this up here. So we first see capitalism is a system of production. What? That's crazy, because people say the word system a lot. They even say system of production a lot. They use words like the structure, the archaeology, the architecture of this and that. They use these words that make you sound really smart, right? Because just saying something like the economy or something like that is boring. But in Marx's case, he actually does have a greater connotation, a greater meaning to an actual model of what a system of production is that's worth explaining, right? He's not just saying it to sound smart. Now, to understand what he means by a system of production, there's a few things that we need to know. Firstly, we'll notice in this whole chapter, just like all the early chapters of this book particularly, he's going to be using a particular reasoning style, a dialectical method of development by which how he comes to understand capitalism, as you can kind of see here that we're going to get into, is through these relations of opposition within the thing in question, by which those oppositions make that thing what it is. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that if we take the commodity is a whole thing, but it is a unity of two contradictory things, use value and exchange value. But we can't talk about one without talking about the other. We can't talk about exchange values without talking about use values, and vice versa. And together, they make up, firstly, the commodity. They make up that thing without which the two oppositions create a unity, which gives that thing its identity. But secondly, the contradiction between the two, the opposing forces within it, give that thing motion. So in the system of production that is capitalism, Marx is going to be talking not just about value, but value in motion. He's not just talking about production, but the process of production. He wants to add this dynamic to everything that he is talking about. Now that might sound really wanky, pretentious, who cares? But the thing is about Marx is he never really offered a systematic explanation of what he means by the dialectical method. There is some commentary in, I believe, the second volume of Capital, and secondly, in Engels's work on what Marx's method was. One of those pieces written by Marx explains his method as turning Hegel on his head, and we're about to explain that. But moreover, how one learns Marx's method is through seeing it in practice, not in theory, not being explained systematically. You just read Marx's work, and you understand his reasoning style through seeing it in action, and that will probably be the same with us while we read Capital together. Now, Hegel on his head, what does that mean? Well, that gets us into also what it means for there to be a system of production. Now, I don't really want to talk about Hegel, but Hegel was an idealist, right? Now, that doesn't really matter what that means, but for Marx, Marx is a materialist. And so he's taking a method that was proposed before him by someone else, and he's reshaping it for a materialist conception of history. Now, what does materialism mean? Does it mean that everything that exists has a tangible physical existence that you can hold on to, like the trees outside or a stone on the pavement or something? Well, no. We'll actually come to see that in Marx's system there are immaterial, objective realities that govern social relations. So that can't be it. And now we see that Marx is actually quite complicated, like he doesn't just fit into some naive physicalist naturalism or anything like that. Rather, what Marx is going to mean is that if we look at all of the relics of great societies, all of the ideals man has pondered on, the great pyramids of Egypt, the Vatican, and all the cathedrals of Europe, and all these higher transcendent qualities that man has tried to reach for through these endeavors, before he can do any of that, he must eat, right? He must subsist in the world. Now, how does man subsist? Well, he mixes his labor with the world around him. He goes out, he picks an apple off a tree through the combination of his labor with the material of the tree. Now he has an apple in his hand that he is ready to eat, while before he mixed his labor, he had nothing to eat. But there's a difference with humanity, right? Because all animals do that. But humanity is uniquely social, right? We don't just go and pick apples off a tree. We go organize into groups. We have a division of labor where we divide ourselves into different classes and have different relationships to the labor process, which generate different interests for these different groups, right? And then now there's a competition between these groups and you have class struggle. But before we even get to class struggle, we first see that mankind is a social species, and he doesn't just pick apples from trees, but he organizes very complex processes of production. And through this advancement of the productive process, you have the birth of society, right? And then those societies decline and fall as that process of production begins to hinder through the interests of various classes and the dynamic of class struggle standing in its way, and eventually resulting in the death of that society. And so what this means then for the materialist is that all of these higher ideals, all of the world's religions, all of the norms, the cultures, their culture, the values, the way we're raised, our mannerisms, all the ideology that governs that society all stems as a means to vindicate that process of production, that organization of labor, typically for the benefit of those who reap the most reward from that labor, who gain the most from that system of production, in order to convince the people at the bottom that they're laboring, they're being in the lower classes, and they're working for the wealth of others, to convince them that the interest of those upper classes that they're subservient to is also their own interest, right? Because ultimately, I said before that before we can ponder higher ideals, we must eat. Even someone like Plato, or Plotinus, all of these Hellenic rationalists. I know Plotinus is later on in the more in the Roman period, but all of these people who are held up in the modern period as representing the idealist philosophy, the rationalist philosophy that says that ideals, that abstract concepts like numbers and forms and ideas are the truest existence. Even they will acknowledge that you need to eat first before you can conceptualize those things, and that adds to the inferiority of the corporeal, empirical, sensory world that we all live in, right? So it's not as simple as that. It goes that step further. Marx goes with his materialist method, that all ideas stem from these subsistence, material conditions that mankind is subjected to, and the social struggle that follows from the way man organizes himself into a system of production to fulfill those material conditions is the vehicle by which all of humanity's ideas and culture and the governing ideology is generated. And so that's what when we talk about a system of production, it doesn't just mean the way we produce things, like what tools we have, what machines we have. It's the way that human beings organize themselves into different classes to perform labor, the relationship they have to those classes and what their particular self-interests are, the ideas that are spawned from that self-interest, and then secondly, the social relations that spring from it, right? So we're going to get more into what this all means. But Marx, when he says system of production, even that itself is packed with ideas, and they have real meaning. It's not just pretentious. So moving forward then, we're talking about capitalism as a system of production. Capitalism produces things. So now we're moving from the word system to the word production. So when capitalism produces stuff, what it produces is a commodity. The unit of the mass of wealth that capitalism produces is the commodity. That's the particular of all the things that it produces. And so when we look at the commodity, first we have to get some basics down, right? So firstly, a commodity has to be external. It can't be a mental state or a proposition or some abstraction like that. It has a real existence outside of the human mind that's tangible. And then if we move on until the twofold nature of the commodity, what the social aspect of the commodity, like other than its just physical and chemical properties, is that it has a use value. So in order for it to be a commodity and not just some random object, it first must satisfy a particular want. It has to have that qualitative sensation of the satisfaction of desire. And this is the substance of all wealth to Marx. The reason why wealth is good to have for somebody is because it means their desires will be satisfied. It has this qualitative component to it of being useful. It has a use value. Now, we'll move on to the second component, which will be exchange value, which is purely quantitative, right? Because if you look at all of the commodities in the world, they all have different use values. They satisfy different desires. I spoke before about picking an apple off a tree. The use value that an apple has is very different from, say, the use value this microphone has to record videos. But yet both the microphone and the apple, which have totally different physical properties, chemical properties, and use values, are exchangeable, right? So they're both worth a certain amount, and they both exchange based on that worth. But what determines that worth, right? There has to be some equivalence between them. Now, it can't be its usefulness, because the use values of all commodities are heterogeneous. It can't be their physical properties, because commodities exchange that are made out of totally different things and have totally different physical and chemical makeups. And so what Marx will propose is that there is a third thing that determines this exchange value. And that third thing is going to be socially necessary labor time, or SNLT. Now, why does he pick this? Some of you might think, well, use values, why can't they be the means by which we exchange something? Well, we already spoke before that use values are qualitative, while exchange values are purely quantitative. And so you're committing a category error if you're saying the reason why an apple and a microphone exchange for certain amounts is because of the usefulness that they have within them, you are now explaining a quantitative phenomenon, the exchange value, by a qualitative phenomenon, and that is a fallacy. And so Marx has to find a third thing that is also strictly quantitative. And what he's going to go for is socially necessary labor time, because the time by which it is measured is a quantity. And so this now allows us to have a categorically correct metric by which we can say this commodity is exchanged by this proportion with another commodity, right? Now we skipped where use values come from, and the reason why is because Marx is not interested in that question. We've just said now that exchange value is determined by socially necessary labor time. But what about use values? Well, Marx says they come from the appetite, the fancy, wherever. It doesn't matter. So he's going to skip that for his investigation into the commodity because it's not really relevant and it's not very contentious. So, given that value is determined by socially necessary labor time, you'll notice that if you half the socially necessary labor time to produce a commodity, then you're going to half its value. If you double the socially necessary labor time, then you double its value, and so on. If a new technology that comes out, which means that this microphone now takes half the socially necessary labor time to be produced, then it's going to half in value, right? And so this means that the advancement of technology actually reduces the value of commodities. And this will be something that we discuss much later on in the book. And it's one of Marx's most ambitious claims. Now, what about this labor, right? Because you might say, well, you said that use values are heterogeneous, but labor is heterogeneous, right? Like the type of labor required to pick an apple is very different from the type of labor required to create this microphone or to bottle water and so on. That's clearly a qualitative heterogeneous phenomenon. Well, Marx is going to say that it's not concrete labor, which is the particular type of labor required to produce something, but abstract labor, right? It's this common form of labor that is analogous to all acts. Another instance that might help explain this is somebody could say, well, what if I just take really long I don't even know how to produce a microphone. If I tried to produce this, well, that would take a very long time, much longer than the average microphone is produced for. And so therefore, wouldn't that microphone be far more valuable if I created it because of my own incompetence? Well, firstly, that exceeds what is socially necessary. What is socially necessary is the aggregate amount of time that all human beings will take, an average, if you will, to create that microphone, because it could hypothetically be created in a much shorter time than if I personally tried to do so. And so we're going to take that as the quantity of time by which the value of the microphone is determined. And so it's this abstract form then, this aggregate of immaterial but yet objective commonality to all human labor, to all concrete labor, that is going to be the determinant of value. And so here you'll notice that abstract labor is this immaterial force within the system of production that we're analyzing here. I mean, it's common to all societies, because in all societies human beings must labor, but it is yet totally immaterial. And so this kind of makes Marx no longer the naive naturalist that he might be painted out to be sometimes, even though he is definitely a materialist. And so, therefore, you can see that there's some nuance required when it comes to approaching Marx's system. You can't just say, well, I'm not a naturalist, and so therefore I can't be a Marxist, right? Now, some of you, again, might be stuck on this idea that, well, why can't use values create the value of a commodity? Well, use value is also not a process, right? It's not a way of doing anything. It's the property that a commodity has. Use value has no existence outside of the consumption of a commodity. It cannot produce anything, right? Use values can be produced by labor, but use values themselves are not a process of producing anything, right? And so therefore, only labor can create value, because only labor actually produces anything. So moving forward then, some of you might think, well, if I can just pick two commodities that exchange at, say, different prices, but yet take the same amount of socially necessary labor time to produce them, then I have now found a counterexample to Marx's labor theory of value, which of course is not his original idea. He's just borrowing this, like much of his terminology and his concepts, from classical economy, like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and the liberal economists of this time. But nonetheless, what Marx will say is that labor theory of value is not the labor theory of price. And exchange value is not price in that regard. What determines price is the social relations of that economy, the supply and demand, and so on. It could be, for instance, that an alien race comes down from the heavens and now declares that microphones will all sell at $1,000 each. And this reign of tyranny over the price of microphones continues on for all eternity. And that would be a social relationship we have to aliens determining the price. But the socially necessary labor time required to create it might well be the same. And so the exchange value would remain the same. Exchange value is not price. Rather, price is an actualization of exchange value. But before exchange value becomes price, it must travel through all the social relations that arrive at the determinate cost of the commodity that we buy and sell in the market or whatever. Now, one last thing I wanted to address is the infamous bad argument against Marx that you might have heard of. You might have made it before. I've probably made it before. Known as the mud pie argument. And this is the notion that if I had a pie shop and rather than using minced meat, because I'm in Australia, we eat meat pies, or blueberries or whatever pie you like to eat, I used mud. I created a mud pie that, in virtue of being made out of mud, was something no one would want to eat or buy. Yet, in virtue of only changing one ingredient, it still takes the same amount of socially necessary labor time to create. Wouldn't that mud pie clearly be far less valuable than a regular pie that takes the same amount of labor time to create it, but yet is far more valuable than if it were made out of mud? Well, Marx will say if we examine the twofold nature of the commodity, for a commodity to be a commodity and not just a thing, it must also have use value, right? And so because a mud pie doesn't satisfy any wants, it's not really a commodity. And so then when it comes to discussing what determines exchange value, we then see ourselves returning to discussing use value, because in virtue of both of them together comprising a commodity, we cannot talk about one without talking about the other. And this returns us to our dialectical approach, to talk about things as relations of oppositions that, in virtue of their contradiction between each other, generate motion within that thing. And in this case, that means determining its value, its exchange ratio by which it exchanges with other commodities, and then its arrival onto the market eventually, which we will discuss in greater detail as we move through the concepts of this book. Okay, so we're now back looking at section 2, entitled The Dual Character of the Labor Embodied in Commodities. So in the last part, we looked at the dual nature of commodities. We looked at exchange value and use value. And so now we're going to be looking at the dual nature of labor, which we already spoke about briefly, if you remember the distinction between concrete labor and abstract labor. But now we're going to be emphasizing those two components and explaining in greater detail what they are. So if we look at labor, just as a commodity has a qualitative component and a quantitative component, within labor there is also this qualitative-quantitative distinction. So the qualitative part would be what is called concrete labor. Now, if we remember from the first section, we talked about how in all commodities there is a total heterogeneity of use values. An apple, this microphone, they all have different desires that they satisfy, and that qualitative exponent is totally different between all of them. And so Marx is going to say that just as there is such a diversity of use values, there is a diversity of useful labor. For every use value, a new type of useful labor emerges by which it is the product of, okay? And so this diversity of labor, this heterogeneity of useful labor, is also where we get the division of labor that makes up not only our system of production but all systems of production. And Marx will also elaborate that even though the commodity is dependent on this division of social labor, the division of social labor is not dependent on the commodity. And we will talk about like Native American villages and so on that have a division of labor but don't produce commodities, and we'll elaborate more on this division of labor later on in the book. But moving forward, we then have what is the real meat of this of Marx's system that's the most difficult to understand, which is abstract labor, and that's what I wanted to and what this section is emphasizing. So abstract labor is quantitative and it is homogeneous. We talked about how all use values have must have some analogous part, an equivalence between all of them, which allows them to exchange despite having totally different use values, physical and chemical properties, and so on. And what that equivalence was, we decided, was the socially necessary labor time within them, this single quantity. And so, before we get on explaining abstract labor, you might look at use values, and you might think, well, surely not only commodities are useful, right? Like, for instance, air that I'm breathing. That's pretty useful for me. I actually need it to survive. And likewise, all the materials of nature, before we mix our labor with them, we do so because they are useful to us. And Marx will say, yes, exactly. So there's this combination between the material and the labor required for the production of a commodity. And so both of them have a use value, the usefulness of the labor and the usefulness of the material. And so in this sense, not only commodities have use value. And you might be like, well, doesn't this contradict what Marx has already said? Well, here we're going to draw a distinction between the value of a commodity and the value of usefulness. So the value of usefulness, it's not just confined to the commodity. It's not just created by labor. It's in nature. But the value of the commodity, which only comes from labor, is purely quantitative and homogeneous, and it is reducible to socially necessary labor time, that quantitative measurement. Right, and so we talked before about this problem of there has to be some type of equivalence, and the equivalence can't be the use value. As Marx says, coats don't exchange for coats, meaning that if they did exchange on the basis of use value, you could only exchange commodities with the same use value rather than heterogeneous ones. But we know that different commodities exchange, and so that must not be the case, right? So the question still arises, how do separate use values created by qualitatively distinct labor processes have a common substance? So what Marx is going to argue is that there has to be a common unit of simple labor power of which all complex, skilled, experienced labor is some multiple of. And that simple form of labor power common to all unique, qualitatively distinct types of labor is abstract labor. Now, this is difficult to understand because abstract labor is seemingly immaterial but yet objective, as we discussed earlier. And so there might be, for instance, an interaction problem. You think, well, how then does abstract labor appear in concrete labor? Well, and not only concrete labor, but all concrete labor, all the different ways you can produce something. Well, the most immediate way that it can be materialized is through the simple common expenditure of human brains, nerves, muscles, etc. And all of that most simple expenditure of human labor power that must take place in all types of labor. That most basic, simple unit that can be measured in quantitative time is what abstract labor, how it scientifically and materially manifests itself. And so what all of this means is that concrete labor is always just some multiple of abstract labor. So the most simple form of labor, like picking an apple, versus the most scientifically, intellectually technical type of labor, like being a nuclear physicist or something, is just a multiple of the latter. And so what Marx will say is the market is always making this reduction, and it is always evaluating commodities by simple abstract labor alone. So there's this natural tendency for us to see the simple unit of labor power within the commodity and evaluate their equivalences and their proportion of exchange on this basis. And so that's going to be section 2, and now we're going to be moving into section 3. Alright, so moving into section 3 of chapter 1, entitled The Form of Value or Exchange Value, we're going to be now examining further this distinction between natural or physical value and commodity value, which is what Marx's investigation is going to be most concerned with, and that is the value that is exchange value and determined by socially less necessary labor time. But if you remember, we said that there's use values in nature. The air that I'm breathing right now has value. It's extremely useful. But yet, it is not the product of human labor power. So how can it be valuable then? Well, Marx makes this distinction between the physical form of value and the value form, by which one is the product of socially necessary labor time and the other is not. Because as the material world, the natural world, without human labor power has usefulness. And labor power itself can also create usefulness. And as Marx will also say, it serves as the basis of primitive exchange. So before commodities exist, which have an exchange value, things are traded based on their usefulness. I think you have something useful, you think I have something useful, and we swap them. But over time, as mankind organizes in more complex ways, creates more divisions of labor and develops their own class interests, and we see the production of the commodity develop, now a new value form emerges, which is exchange value, and this is immaterial, yet objective, and from labor. Now it is immaterial because it is purely social in nature. As Marx says, it has not an atom of value within it, but it is objective and scientific because it is seen in the relationships between commodities. It becomes manifest and observable through the relationships commodities have to each other as they relate through the form of exchange. So therefore we see that through the development of the social nexus, commodities come into existence, they compare to each other, they exchange with each other at different ratios, and through those relationships, we then get a glimpse at value as it becomes manifest through exchange. So the most simple version of this commodity value is known as the relative value form, which is where simply two commodities compare to each other. You have X amount of commodity A being equivalent to Y amount of commodity B. So for instance, one shirt equals 3 pairs of shoes, or something like that. And this is the most simple relation between commodities that makes value, or the value form, visible through exchange. Because we'll notice that value, despite having a objective existence, can only be seen through the relative comparison of other commodities. In other words, the relative value form becomes clear through a social nexus of different relationships between commodities and people buying and selling, or in other words, the market, right? And so through the market, the invisible substance, social substance of human labor, and its the value that it determines becomes seen through exchange value. But after a while, we'll notice something about this relative value form. We get the expanded form, because essentially what happens is if you have X amount of commodity A equaling to Y amount of commodity B, well, to find out the value of the next commodity, we then have to compare that to a third commodity yet again. If one shirt is equal to 3 pairs of shoes, then 3 pairs of shoes is equal to like, I don't know, some small fraction of an automobile, and then that is equal to something else. There's this series of comparisons that have to weigh up to get the true value of a commodity, which would continue until all commodities are factored into this equation. And that's regressive, and it breaks down. And so then what happens from this expanded form is we get a general form. And now this general form is when one single commodity is standardized to be the equivalent of all commodities, but yet this commodity itself has no relative value without its own expanded form. So if you take silver as the standardized commodity, then to know the value of silver, you have to see how much it compares and weighs up to the value of every other commodity that it is in circulation with. And so from this, you have many different general forms. In one area, they might use this. In another area, you might use that. Or maybe there's just two competing in the same place. And so they collapse into a single form known as the money form. And there's many advantages that this money form has. Firstly, and most basically, as anyone who's read basic economics would know, is that no longer is a double coincidence of wants required for commodities to exchange. Before, if I was selling weapons and I wanted meat, and I went to the person who sells meat, and they didn't want my weapons, then I wouldn't be getting any meat. There had to be a double coincidence of wants. You have to want what I'm selling in order there to be an exchange. But now with money, when one single commodity is valued as an equivalent to others, now I can just buy that thing that I want with money, because I will always be accepted. But the thing is, with the general form can also, just because it is a equivalent that measures the value relative to other commodities, that doesn't mean it can be exchanged. If you look at, for instance, ancient Sumeria, where they would use precious metals to value commodities circulating in the marketplace, that precious metal was solely used as a means of bureaucratic accounting, and it would just rack up in the temple, and it actually didn't circulate at all. It was solely used to measure the value of goods, and unlike a true money form, it could not serve as a medium of exchange, and so was vastly inferior. Now, we notice about this analysis as money form is a commodity, right? It has a physical existence, but money then through debt obligation will become fiat, and this is when, rather than the value of the commodity serving as money is what is being traded, the IOU, the debt, becomes what is exchanged and the measure of value itself, which is a whole nother phenomena that we might get into a bit later. Okay, we're going to be moving into section 4, the last section of chapter 1, entitled The Fetishism of Commodities, and it is the fetishism of the commodity and its secret. Okay, so that is going to be discussing some of the themes of the last section, and then seeing what this actually means, what are the consequences of this. And just to recap, what we were talking about was that value is only seen through exchange, right? And just to recap on why that is, because we spoke about a lot of different components of value, use value, exchange value, and the commodity form versus the natural form, and so on. The takeaway for this section is that through the exchange of two commodities, there has to be some equivalence between them. This was first noticed by Aristotle, but moreover what Marx will add is that equivalence between them, which allows them to exchange. That quantitative similarity is the abstract socially necessary human labor time, right? And so Marx will also say the reason Aristotle didn't make this further observation is because his society hinged on the institution of slavery, and to denote human labor as the value-creating substance in a commodity would be really threatening to that, and so we didn't. But so we see from this, we have this mystical value that is unseen except when it appears in the relative relationship between two commodities at a point of exchange. Okay, so the commodity then has this metaphysical nature, right? And what this means, Marx is going to say, is that it is given this quality that it doesn't really have. That's what the word fetish means. The fetish, there's like a sexual fetish, but originally the word comes from religion. And what a fetish was to give an object and to venerate that object because of the belief that it had supernatural or metaphysical properties, which it doesn't actually have. And this is where we get idol worship from, right? So, for instance, a mask in a tribal society in the Neolithic or something would have this quality of being a gateway to another world by which some divine face comes down and is given voice through one of the members of the tribe. But really, the mask is just a piece of wood. Well, same with the idol worship in the Bible or something. It's these statues that are believed to be the face of the god that they represent, but really they're just dull, mute pieces of wood. And so the fetish is then to give something a quality which it doesn't actually possess. And in this case, we're going to be talking about the commodity, which is the product of labor, which is innately social, because different people who have different jobs, in a different division of labor, they come and produce, and they have a social relationship which allows for that commodity to come into existence, but then that is only seen through the exchange of the commodities themselves, not the relationship between men and women and children and workers that actually produced it, right? And so then the commodity is given this property which it doesn't actually have, and this enigma is actually how products of labor become commodities. We spoke before about how in primitive times goods would be exchanged on the basis of their use values because they were not yet commodities. Well, now we're seeing the process in greater detail by which those goods become a commodity. It's through this concealment of the value creating substance and its innately social characteristic becoming concealed in the good, in that product, and then the exchange of those products being mistaken for the social relationship between producers. So, for instance, if we look at a shoe, let's just say there has to be someone has to make plastic, someone has to make leather, tan leather from an animal, and then that gets taken to a factory floor. Within the factory floor, there is its own division of labor where somebody makes the sole of the shoe, somebody makes the laces, someone makes the little plastic thing on top of them even. Then they get assembled somewhere in the factory and are put together to create a shoe. Then the shoe is exported through truck drivers and it's delivered through other people's labor to wherever that needs to go, to the storefront. But then when I approach the storefront to exchange my money for the shoe, all of that is concealed within the commodity. It's stamped on it in the price of the shoe, and the actual social relationships which bring it into existence are totally gone. No one thinks about them. And so we see the social relations between the workers, something like I just described. They become the social relations between things. They become the price, the money that I give, and the commodity that I receive. And so the latter obscures the former. The exchange and the ratio of how different commodities weigh up to each other obscures the actual social relations that give rise to them. And so here's the paradox. Social labor becomes seen through exchange, but it becomes invisible through exchange. And so this concealment of the social characteristic of labor in the commodity, this will be even more perfected by the money form and made even more absurd by the money form. Because when I exchange two commodities, so like some linen for some wool or something like that, that is the two individuals' labor or the group of individuals who had to produce them being obscured in the commodity and being concealed by their exchange. But with the money form, because money is the universal equivalent that reveals the value of all commodities, now we have between this exchange the commodity or the product of labor of an individual and its social characteristic being concealed, and the social relations of all of society in that universal commodity, that universal equivalent, being concealed as well. And so through money, this commodity fetishism, the whole social relation of society is then concealed. And so that's going to do it for chapter 1. And Now we'll be moving on to the second chapter of Capital.